now. So good afternoon and welcome to this new series on solar energy. I think this is our fourth series that we put together, and we want to thank you for joining us today. I'm Tom Murphy. I'm the Solar Education Advisor with the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, and I'm also the recently retired director of the Penn State Marcellus Center. I'll be your host today and also the moderator for the remainder of the session as we go through and for the Q&A. Co-sponsoring this session today, this is I should make notation, this is a 5-part solar series that we're doing. And the co-sponsors today will be Cornell University, Ohio State University, along with us from Pennsylvania and the Farm Bureau offices in those respective 3 states. Before we dig into the topics and introduce our speakers, I always like to add a quick disclaimer to mention that the intention of today's session and those that are going to follow today is not to promote solar, but to offer insights on how our solar technologies operate, the associated impacts and implications, and how participants can better be informed and make knowledge-based decisions, science-based decisions. We also want to emphasize that this is a tri-state series. There's just some differences in regulations between those 3 states in the deployment of solar, and again, in and around some of the policy and certainly the regulatory side. The first session today will be themed to the impacts of solar on rural communities and what we've learned from Align research. We thought that was an important topic, so we've brought together people today in a panel that's going to talk about that from several different perspectives and some of the research that's ongoing right now that we think that you'll find interesting and will add to the broader conversation as we think about this going forward. Every 2 weeks on this day and time until Thanksgiving, we'll explore different perspectives on solar from developers to landowners and also community leaders. We sent out a notification. Hopefully you received that and you can see the topics and the themes along with, as I mentioned, the date and times for those. Then lastly, on November the 22nd, which is actually a Wednesday, we'll have our final Q&A to reconnect the speakers and the participants that have lingering questions. So please consider joining us on that follow-up session on that day, as well as the sessions that will be occurring between now and then. Today, we're excited to have for our panel Sarah Mills from the University of Michigan, Brady Campbell from Ohio State University, and Mohammed Badissi from Penn State Law at Dickinson College. I'd like to give you a quick bio on our different members here today. Dr. Sarah Mills is the director of the Center for Empowering Communities and professor of practice in urban and regional planning program at the University of Michigan. Her research looks at how renewable energy development impacts rural communities positively and negatively, the disparate reactions of rural landowners to wind and solar projects, and how state and local policies facilitate or hinder renewable energy development. She's currently working on a DOE-funded research project, understand the adoption of solar energy ordinances, zoning ordinances, and the impacts of solar on agricultural communities, as well as conducting a nationwide survey on solar farm neighbors. Actually, that's part of the connection of where I met Sarah a number of years ago in a similar type of work. Through a grant with Michigan's State Energy Office, she also helps communities in incorporating clean energy into their planning and zoning. Sarah received her doctorate in urban and regional planning from the University of Michigan, where her dissertation looked at the intersection of farmland preservation and wind energy development. And a point to note, she also serves on the City of Ann Arbor's Planning Commission, and I know she's chaired that as well. So she comes with a lot of hats that she wears, which I think is important when you think about the research that she's going to talk about. Our second speaker is going to be Brady Campbell. Brady is an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at The Ohio State University, where he currently serves as a state small ruminant extension specialist. Brady is also a 4th-generation shepherd, where he and his wife, Haley, help to manage and operate the family farm that runs approximately 300 ewes and 100 sows. Brady's research and extension work is closely related to the direct needs of Ohio's small ruminant, thinking about sheep and goat producers, which is a part of what we'll be talking about today when we think about the agrivoltaics component. An area of great interest of his includes vegetation management within utility scale solar developments within the Midwestern United States. Brady and his colleagues were also recently awarded a grant through the DOE-funded FARMS program, which is the Foundational Agrivoltaic Research for Megawatt Scale. Again, this was a funding notice that came from the Department of Energy, and this is intended to investigate alternative vegetation management strategies within solar farm areas. The last speaker is going to be Mohammed Badisi, one of my colleagues from Penn State. Mohammed is with Penn State Law. Mohammed and I have been doing programs on solar ordinance development, looking at case studies and the practical application of solar ordinances across the state of Pennsylvania, as well as the work that he does on an international basis, looking at the legal side or the contractual side of energy and energy policy. Mohammed is a faculty member at Penn State Law. Will be talking to us today about related research that he and his students have been working on over the course of the last couple of years. I will also mention that we have in the background Garrett Livermore from Cornell. And Garrett is our technical whiz today, and he is coordinating, again, in the background, any questions we might have and make sure we stay on track with the technical side of our webinar today. Along that aspect, I also want to mention, if you do have questions as we go through the presentations, please put your questions in the chat pod. We'll circle back to them as we complete the webinar. We're going to hold all the questions to the end, and then we'll circle back and go through as many of those as we have time at that point in time. Any that we don't get through today, we're going to record, and we'll have a chance to come back to them going forward when we think about the final session we do in November. We've set that session up specifically to be able to do any remaining questions and any questions that might be new going forward. So with that, Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you. What we'll do is we're going to go through all three of the speakers. They're going to have 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll come back together at the end. We'll convene and we'll go through the questions. So Sarah, we're going to start with you.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me hit my share screen, confirming that you guys can see what we've got.
I can see it.
Amazing. All right, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll confess that I am not one of the three, like Michigan is not one of the three states that is part of the trifecta here. Thank you for bringing in an interloper. I know enough about each of your states to be dangerous. So I will tell you that my perspective is really farther west and kind of the Great Lakes area. I'll tell you, as Tom mentioned, about a project that we have in the works. And it's really driven, as he said in the introduction, I'm really interested in energy as they intersect with rural communities, and particularly farmland preservation. So what drives a lot of conversation here in my part of the country is solar a new threat or an opportunity? And this is really from the farmer's perspective, but I am really interested in thinking beyond just the person who has solar on their property, but kind of that entire farming community. To be clear, I'm not talking about agrivoltaics. I'm really talking, but as Tom teed up, that's something that Brady is going to be able to speak to. So what I'm speaking about, and you should keep that in your mind as I'm talking through the economic impacts, is really a site that is designed with energy generation first and foremost in mind. And so here are examples from my neck of the woods that you can see, but actually these projects here are relatively small in comparison to what's coming. We now have a project in the state of Michigan that's 1,900 acres. There's another one that's proposed that's at 5,000 acres. And so what I'm really trying to understand is kind of what is the impact? I would say that for a community, solar is economic development. Utility scale solar is economic development. And it's economic development on a couple of different in a couple of different ways. So at the individual level, it started with the picture about the farmer. For the person, the farmland owner, and again, even though solar can happen on different kinds of landscapes, I am thinking about this on currently farmed land, because at least in my part of the country, that's where solar developers often want to go. So for that farmland owner, there are lease payments that go, or that go to them. In some situations, there are also payments made to landowners who are neighboring that property. So don't necessarily have solar on their land, but either have some sort of underground easement to get the wires to the grid, or are just compensated as a result of living next to or maybe immediately surrounded by solar panels. So that's at the individual level. I'm also interested in the community level. So one thing that while the impacts vary from state to state, in most states, there's some sort of property tax payment that solar developers make that goes towards the local government. Sometimes for these large projects, developers are also making direct donations to communities. There are a small number of long-term jobs once the solar project is in the operational phase, and that's keeping solar panels in good working order, but most of it is actually managing the site itself, managing the vegetation around the site. And then there are lots of short-term jobs in construction. So that's the case for solar as economic development. But there's opportunity costs associated. There can be opportunity costs associated with solar as well. So again, thinking in the perspective of this as a land use that is going to what is currently cultivated land, there's displacement of previous agricultural activity on that site. And it's maybe the new property taxes that are made are replacing whatever the property, how that land was taxed previously. And then in terms of community-wide impacts too, the jobs that are displaced in the ag sector. So as Tom teed up, we're studying this as part of a DOE funded project. You can get more on this from this link down here. It's a big project. It looks at zoning, so linking to what Mohammed is doing, as well as the economic impacts. And I've just circled the couple of tasks that have to do with specifically with the economic impacts. So in task 2, we're collecting tax policies. As you'll see in just a minute, I'm also conducted interviews on the economic impacts with both solar leaseholders and local government officials in the places where there are solar farms. That's feeding into this tool, this calculator, to be able to forecast economic impacts of solar in a particular place. And then we're also using that to generate solar development scenarios that really try to maximize the benefits, the economic benefits to specific rural communities. So to build that calculator, you have to understand, let's put a dollar value on all of those things that factor into the economic impacts. So that's largely driven by interview data that we have. We looked at all solar projects that were greater than or equal to 5 megawatts. So land-wise, at least 25 acres, often more. And I didn't add this onto the slide. In rural places in our 6 states that we're looking at, which is it's Great Lakes states. So Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. So that's kind of our pool of interest. But we pulled data and tried to get interviews from all of the landowners who have solar on their property in those 6 states. There were 102 landowners, and 12 of them, we sent them each 2 letters, and 12 of them we were able to do interviews with. We also emailed and did phone calls to the county or township officials in these areas. Some of these states have siting done at the county level, and some states it's down at the town or township level. And so that's why there's kind of a mix there. Emails went out to all 93 folks across these states, and we heard back from 19 of them. And the key things that we were trying to understand in these interviews are, well, first of all, how much solar land is leased versus purchased? You're going to see that that's going to factor into one of our actually surprising findings here. Another thing that we wanted to know is, what are solar leaseholders or the county officials who are getting tax revenues doing with that revenue? And we wanted to know what they're doing with it, because that's important to understand how those dollars, those lease dollars or those tax dollars, recirculate in the local economy. When I was explaining this to folks, when we kind of pitched the idea to DOE, I want to know if the people with solar panels on their property are using this as a retirement strategy and taking their lease revenue with them to Arizona or Florida. That's where people in Michigan retire to, or if this is if this is supplementing their farm income. And as you'll see, we got stories of both. And then in this, we're trying to compare kind of the before and after. So understanding what impacts this has made. And in all of these places, we're looking at solar that went on ag land. What we learned from our landowner interviews, again, in our region, lease rates ranged from $700 to $1,250 per acre per year. Almost all of those leases had an escalator to keep up with inflation, or sometimes to exceed inflation. We did not find in our region any pattern in terms of who was getting 700 versus 1,250. What we found is within a project, leases tended to be similar, but it's not like larger projects or newer projects paid more or less. We weren't able to pick that up. But again, this is the early days of large-scale solar development in the Midwest. And so we have a really small data set to be working from. In all of these landowners that we talked to that are leaseholders, they were all doing solar. This number here was a whole lot better than what they were able to get for cash rent previously if they had leased their land out to a farmer. And for the ones who farmed the land themselves, they were explicit that like this was more than what those particular fields were yielding on average. And so, they act as rational actors do, which is, make sure that the lease for solar is going to be a good deal for them. In terms of how they use the revenues, what we found in the 12 solar leaseholders that we talked to, 6 out of the 12 were active farmers. And so those folks either reinvested in their farm, which is what Tom teed up in my dissertation. That's what I found that people with wind turbines on their property do, is they take the revenue that they get from the wind turbines and reinvest that in their farm. So some folks with solar on their property do that. And some are putting the money in the bank, and they told me in preparation for retirement. The other 6 solar leaseholders, 3 of the 6 were not former farms, they were former farmers. And so this is their retirement income. I did a lot of these interviews myself, and I don't know that I caught anybody kind of in there that had moved away. We also, of the solar leaseholders that we got, 3 of them were heirs. They were absentee landowners to that property anyway. They had previously been leasing it out to a tenant farmer, and instead now they're leasing to a solar developer. And for them, like, how do they use the revenue? They're putting the money in the bank. So the key impact that this makes for figuring out how solar factors into local economic development is that in these situations, if the landowner is local or not, impacts how those dollars recirculate in that place. Another thing that we found is that not all land is leased. And so in this area, 62% of the land in the Great Lakes that was in a solar farm as of 2020, that was operational as of 2021, 62% is held by a person or a farm operation. but 27% was purchased by a solar developer, which we don't see in wind. So this was a surprising finding because people didn't realize that solar developers here were offering to buy the land. And then 11% of the land that's in solar farms in the Midwest is either public land, often that it's held by a public utility, or it's a non-energy private company. So Campbell Soup Company has a solar farm on their property, probably to, get the clean energy benefits from that. The reason that this is important to the economic modeling is that this is a one-time infusion of cash into that to that person versus an annual cash flow. And so that's going to come back in just a minute. We also did interviews with local government officials, and how noticeable the tax revenues are in their place into their community depends on the project size. So bigger projects are going to pay more taxes, and so that's going to actually be noticeable, but also on the tax structure. So in Minnesota, it was easier for the interviewees to point to like how much taxes solar projects were paying, because it's not in the normal ad valorem tax approach. Like they have a separate stream of income there. In Indiana, they have a statewide tax policy that says the local government is capped in how much revenue it can receive. If new development comes, then it displaces it effectively. The local government's spending pie can't grow, but instead all of the other taxpayers pay less. The solar developers are now paying a significant portion of it. Most of the local government officials said it was something, but not huge. They noted that few developers were making direct donations to the community, but also that there weren't negative economic impacts. And the big takeaway from this is that what economic impact solar would have at the county level is really dependent on local tax structure or the state level tax structure. And so that's going to be different across the 3 states here. So all of this information is being fed into a calculator that is being developed by Stephen Miller, an economist at Michigan State. It's an Excel-based calculator. It looks at both the installation, early phase, and operations phases. It's looking specifically, not globally, at all of the economic impacts, but specifically at the county level impacts. And it's picking up not just the direct impacts, but the indirect and induced impacts. The idea that dollars circulate when they're paid. This is my non-economist assessment of how this tool works. So for you others that are not economists on here, like hopefully this is helpful for you. On the positive side, you have solar jobs, lots of them during installation phase, fewer of them that are local during the operations phase. You've got tax revenues, the new taxes that solar developers are paying. It may be, though, that it's instead lowering taxes to residents, but then it means that the rest of the residents in that community have more money that they can spend, more money in their pockets that they can spend locally. And then there's also that landowner payment side. On the negative side, though, you are displacing agricultural activity and ag jobs. And what's important in this calculator is that it considers that there are different yields, agricultural yields in different counties. So that it's taking that into effect. We're building the calculator right now, so I can only share with you what our preliminary observations are. And that is that, first of all, government and individual spending provide similar kind of in-county multipliers, similar in terms of magnitude. Ag spending multiplies a lot more locally, and so displaced ag has kind of a higher impact. So like you're weighing that out when it's going from ag into people's bank accounts or into the local government spending when there's more taxes paid. So that's one of the things. But you can kind of know that on paper already. Where the original landowners are in county, leasing versus purchasing makes a big difference. That one-time infusion of cash versus payments over time makes it has a significant impact in the model. And so in some places, if the land is purchased versus leased, it could tip in the leasing structure. Most of the time, solar is a net positive. But if it's purchased, it might be a net negative over to this overall kind of county level. But I want to acknowledge that there's things that are missing from this calculator too. So weren't able to capture the neighboring landowner payments. That wasn't part of this project. It doesn't include impacts on the tenant farmers, and anecdotally, I've heard a lot about that. And it also doesn't include impacts on the overall the market for ag land. In terms of what's next on this part of this project, we're launching the calculator kind of in the winter, so keep your eyes out for that. And then, as I mentioned before, the task 6, which is expected next summer, is allowing us to take this information about how productive ag land is, kind of what the tax policy is, and figure out like where would you put solar to like maximize benefit to rural economies. If you have any questions later on that we can't answer or want to know more, you can contact me here. And thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate the comments and certainly the research that you're doing. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in the that research in particular in that calculator. I hear it already from communities asking very similar type questions. So we're intrigued by the work and certainly interested to see how it develops over the course of time. We're going to move to our next speaker, and that's going to be Brady Campbell. And Brady is going to bring us up to speed on some of the work that they're doing as part of this FARMS project. So Brady, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good. Thanks, Tom. You can see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon from the Buckeye State. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and discuss some of the things that we here at Ohio State are working on. And I always like to give a big shout out to my team that you can see here listed on the screen. Quite a few different backgrounds, and I enjoy coming in and talking to these types of groups for these types of discussions, because I'm kind of the odd man out, for a lack of better terms. I'm the animal scientist that comes into this mix, and I'm really excited for the future opportunities, especially as it relates to our small ruminant producers here in the state of Ohio. So what we're going to be discussing just briefly here is our project of agrivoltaics, the integration of this agriculture, forage, and livestock production systems within these utility scale solar arrays that are being placed here in the state of Ohio. All right. This is kind of a slide set from a larger presentation that I typically give, but I just wanted to give a brief background of, what do we know? What is out there in the current literature in terms of agrivoltaic research? And typically, a lot of this information is lacking from a statistical standpoint and a research standpoint. I know that there are several people across the nation that have put sheep under solar panels, but there's not a lot of data out there that supports what occurs when those animals are in those scenarios. So a lot of the data that has been generated is less than 40 acres in size. For example, the site that we'll be working on, although we're only working on a small portion of it, is 1,100 acres. And so nothing to our knowledge has been published to anything of that size and scale. Now, we would assume that a lot of this would be very similar to those folks that are working in vineyards, the silvo pasture and agroforestry production systems. We're just replacing some of those other plants with solar panels in the racking and the arrays. The one most important thing that I always like to discuss, especially being an animal scientist, is that vegetation management does not always equal animal growth, performance, health, welfare, and well-being. And I think that's a key point that we need to take into consideration as we move forward. Some things that we're really concerned about and interested in is as it relates to forage yield, and that may be a concern to some folks because we know that we want to maintain a specific forage height, not to shade out these panels per se for solar production, but we also need to make sure that if we put animals into these systems, that they're providing the nutrition that they need when they need it. So we're always taking a look at different ground cover options. We're also interested in what the impacts of both pre-construction and post-construction is within these types of systems, as well as panel shade, not only on the forages that are growing in these facilities, but also the animals as well. But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that what we're doing with our work is that these solutions that we come forward with must be scalable. They must be applied in those 40-acre sites or even those 5,000-acre sites that they talk of. So just briefly, we did do some preliminary research work with our partners that you see here on the screen. So subsidiary group that we continue to work with is Between the Rows, and we're really interested in doing these agricultural production practices between the rows of these solar panels. So just to give yourself a brief overview of what some of that preliminary work did that helped us push forward to our DOE Farms grant that we were successfully received. We worked with some folks that had a small commercial swine farm that decided to put in a small racking solar array that would mock traditional racking that you would see in the industry. And so our first study and first work was taking a look at a series of different forage treatments. We don't have to really go into detail, but just note that each of these colors represent a different forage type, forage variety. Alfalfa should be familiar to folks that feed livestock. Cool season hay mix would be a mixture of different grasses and legumes. So like white clover, for example, that you would see in your yard. And then we've got another series of types of forages that we consider as annuals. You can also see that we've got it based on a specific seeding rate. According to our manuals that we have here at the university and through the Midwest, there's a specific seeding rate that's associated with each of these forage types, meaning pounds of seed per unit of area that needs to be laid down to have a successful establishment of forage in those areas. One of the things that my initial team was interested in is that because of the shade and because of the construction that occurs, rather than going with that 100% seed rate, could we decrease it to 75%, or do we need to increase it to 125% of the recommendations because of what is going on during those processes? So this is just a brief example, a nice picture of what that array system looks like. They are set to scale in terms of alley width and height of these panels. Now I know, again, it's very small in terms of structure and size, but nonetheless, it was a nice preliminary piece of information to get us moving forward. Here's some images of my initial team here establishing their forages. For those that work in the industry, probably understand the challenges of this pretty well. A lot of weed encroachment in some of our test plots and our control plots. This was supposed to be a plot that had our cool season grasses and clovers in there. You can see not a lot happening here. This is actually an invasive weed here. This is our giant foxtail, which provides very little nutritional quality, if anything at all, to our grazing livestock. Down in the left-hand corner here, you can see that we're taking some forage samples on our alfalfa stands. Still pretty bare, some weed pressure here as well. And you can also see the weed pressure off to the right-hand side. For a lack of better terms, I don't want to get into the weeds, but we are going to talk a little bit about animal nutrition. And this is forage nutritive values for alfalfa during that 2021 trial. Off to the right-hand side, you can see that we've got the differences of desirable forage in green and weeds, which would be something that we didn't plant, even if an animal would eat it and receive some type of nutrition. In our alfalfa plots, you can see that they did extremely well. However, you can see that there really wasn't much difference between the different types of seeding rates, as well as whether they were in full sun or if they were within the shade. So we were quite pleased with this, that our alfalfa took off quite well. I also want to point out here, this is how we measure the nutritive value of our different forage types as feed sources for our livestock. Crude protein being one. That's represented in our green bars, and TDN describes total digestible nutrients, represented in our yellow bars. So for an example, if we were to feed 100 pounds of hay that we made off of this alfalfa field, this information here is telling us that 64%, for example, in this alfalfa 100% sun or 100% seeding rate in the shade, 64% or 64 pounds of that 100 pounds of hay that we fed will be available to that animal. So our systems in animal nutrition are not always 100%, but this is a really good value, as you can see down here in our metric below. Anything that has a TDN value that's greater than 62% is considered a supreme product when we have it on sale at the local market. You can also see that our crude protein reports here, anything below or above 18 is good, preferably above 22 is prime. Very few of these drop below prime. And interestingly enough, the ones that drop below prime are those ones that are in the full sun. All right, so keep that into mind. So we hypothesize using this data that even though we may have a reduction in overall forage yield, meaning amount of forage or amount of feed available, we are actually increasing the quality of our product that we're feeding to our animals, allowing them being underneath those shaded areas. Here are some photos from 2022. You can see that a year of establishment was certainly needed in order for our forages to establish a really nice root base and really take off. This is after appropriate fertilization needs as well. So here's our alfalfa here. This is going to be our annual forages. And here's that cool season hay grass mix that we saw earlier that looked pretty poor. You'll also note that we didn't even spray anything, and the giant foxtail has now been shaded out and swamped out by all these desirable forages that we had previously planted. So as we're thinking about this, one of the goals of our group in terms of forage and vegetation management is this idea of developing hay-ready solar. Our goal of our project is really putting farming back into our farmers' hands, because we all know some of the challenges that we're getting in terms of community pushback and aversion to utility scale solar. But if we're able to demonstrate multi-use land strategies, one of them being a farming practice, it has been seemingly well received by those community members. And this is just a nice slide showing you all the processes involved with hay making, anywhere from mowing, both of these types of stands. Again, this is standard equipment that you would see out in a regular agronomic field, still being operational within the solar array, raking it up after it's dried, and then simply baling it as well. So this is a good indicator. A lot of people say, well, that's all fine and dandy. We don't believe you can do it. We've got physical evidence here in the form of photos that indeed this can be done. Just as we saw previously, I did want to point out that our forage values in terms of quality, that nutritive value, did increase coming into 2022. So again, your stands may not look really good in terms of that first establishment year, but once you get into years 2, 3, 4, 5, and on down the road, and you take care of those forage stands like an agronomic field, you can see that it will pay dividends in the end. So really, it comes back to this concept of, can we make hay and graze at the same time? For me, we've got roughly 250,000 acres in the state of Ohio that's currently been slated to be put into these utility scale solar arrays, and a lot of folks are interested in the grazing component of it, and I certainly am as well. Unfortunately, to be able to graze that type of property, that type of area and land mass, we don't even have enough sheep in the United States in order to get that job done effectively and efficiently. So we are going to be forced to take a look at some other alternative options. So in our mind, one of the practices that we're going to implement is this hay-ready solar, producing some high-quality feedstuffs for some of our other livestock enterprises off agronomic land that was already previously in production. So our fertility should be there, and these farmers know how to manage this land. Now, of course, hay making isn't 100%. You can see that there are some forages that are left over in specific areas, and there's also places that our mowers simply can't reach. After we harvest this high quality and valuable product, we're going to turn the sheep out into these areas and be able to graze customarily around some of these pilings, but also be able to graze without mowing these facilities as well. So that kind of leads us down the pike of what we were doing with this farms grants. And we've got 4 buckets we like to call, or 4 research areas that we are specifically focusing on that we'll review here now. The first area of interest is one that I've talked about quite a bit, the idea of hay-ready solar, producing these high-quality feedstuffs. Again, thinking about multi-use land strategies. Previously, these fields were always used for agronomic row crop production. But now, when we're implementing hay-making processes, we're generating solar power, electricity. We're also generating a high-quality feedstuff for livestock. And then we're going to integrate that complementary grazing strategy as well. So rather than just having one enterprise or one product coming from this land in our project, we're going to have 3 different sources of income. And that should be really appealing to our producers in the agricultural community. Current sites, are they accommodating? That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be using some different technologies to ensure that some of these practices that we're proposing will work. And you're going to see that come in our 3rd bullet point from Precision Ag Technology. How do we expect this to have an impact of forage yield? We've already demonstrated that in some of our early preliminary work, where we've seen that we do see a decrease in overall forage yield, but there's an increase in forage quality. With some of these products being valued at upwards of $500 a ton, really high quality alfalfa hay being valued there again, $500 a ton. Even if we produce a ton less per unit of area, we're more than likely going to pay for it in the back end because of the quality that we're putting to the market. And again, it really comes down to this idea of community acceptance. How can we get our producers, our farmers, more interested and more involved in this concept of utility scale solar? The next area of interest relates to the construction impacts on soil health. So how are sites typically built in Ohio? What we've been seeing is that a lot of these sites are going in more in the western part of the state. And for those that aren't familiar with our state, the eastern part is kind of cattle and sheep country. It's more of the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. But as you travel west, it's more of that flat land, heavy, dark, nutrient-rich soil. And that's where a lot of these solar projects are going in. Even if you think there is no grade to those facilities, a lot of times our developers are going through and grading those facilities. And if they're not grading them, we're still driving and operating heavy machinery to get those pilings driven. And so when we think from the standpoint of soil compaction and soil agribility, there's a big challenge with trying to get some of these forages successfully established. Not to mention, we're also competing with some of those weeds from the weed bank that's built up over the years as well. So thinking about how we can implement some different strategies in terms of cover crops or anything else in between to help alleviate some of those compaction issues. And again, thinking about some of those lease agreements, typically it's about a 30-year lease, and a lot of times we've been hearing producers report back that the developer companies have stated that they will relinquish the land back to the farmer themselves, and the land will be as suitable as it was prior to the lease agreement. However, there's no data on that. We don't know what the impacts of construction and long-term use is, and that's something that we're very interested in. As it relates to precision agricultural technology, we're going to be implementing some different techniques as it relates to autonomy. Labor is a massive issue regardless of the enterprise that you look into, and it may be difficult as it relates to this area of interest as well. So we're going to use some autonomy with some of our equipment, with some of the partners that we are working with, to see if we can improve efficiency throughout the system, see if we can improve end of row turn radius. Does that mean we have to skip a row or go every other row, and so forth? Are those perimeter fences going to be butted right up against the end of those panels, or is there going to be enough distance where we can get some of that equipment out and around to get to the next area? And also, what is our efficiency as we work through these systems with some more obstructions than what we are typically used to? And then when we think about vegetation management, this is going to be one of the highest costs that this facility is going to incur post-construction. So if we can make this as a revenue generating enterprise at the end of the day to reduce the economic burden, we think that it will benefit everybody involved as well. And then certainly not last but not least, something that sits near and dear to my heart is thinking about some of these complementary grazing strategies. So the idea of grazing these utility scale sites, what is our stocking density? How many animals do we need per unit of area? As it relates to nutrition, really focusing in and honing in on forage quality, ensuring that we're putting the right type of sheep into these systems that will be able to be sustainable and be able to survive in those kind of conditions. From a health aspect, to our knowledge, nothing's been reported in terms of respiratory care because those panels are shorter in terms of height. Will it capture some of that ammonia from the urine and manure? Because these animals will seek out shade. We know that. And we know that they're going to spend more time underneath those panels. But also what's going to happen? They'll probably urinate, defecate. Will that further lead to some other health issues such as parasites, hoof health as it relates to foot rot? Thinking about some of these plants that may be in these seed banks as it relates to the poisonous plants, how can we mitigate some of those challenges to ensure that the shepherd has a good go at this? From a behavioral standpoint, we assume that they will go to the shade, but thinking about time budget, how much of their day is spent in the shade, and what are they doing while they are in the shade? Also, is there a grazing preference? Do they prefer to graze under the panels because of the shade, or is it because the forage under the panels is of higher and greater quality? And then when we think about welfare and animal well-being, are we truly meeting the needs of these animals as it relates to their 5 freedoms? So with that being said, I know I've spat out a lot of sheep stuff. My contact information is here, and looking forward to our last presenter and questions here after a bit. Appreciate the opportunity again, Tom. Thanks, guys.
Brady, thanks for your comments. We look forward to circling back with you with some questions that we're definitely going to have for you here. Our next speaker is going to be Mohammed Badissi. And Mohammed, if you want to bring up your slides. While Mohammed is doing it, I'll just remind everybody, if you do have additional questions, I know some people have been asking them and some have been answering them as well. please put your questions in the chat pod. So if you could go ahead and do that. And as soon as we're done with Mohammed's presentation, we'll circle through those questions and try to answer as many of them as we can. So thank you. And Mohammed, it's all yours.
Oh, thanks, Tom. And just to confirm, to make sure, how are we on time? I'm happy to speed up if necessary.
You have about 20 minutes max.
Never give a lawyer extra time. That is a bad choice from the beginning.
Well, then 15 minutes is your limit.
Fair enough. Thanks, Tom. Again, greetings, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be with you here today. I have been having these discussions on a regular basis, and I have to say this is all thanks to the leadership of Tom, our host here today. I have an interesting background. Just to note that I started my career as a lawyer in private practice representing oil and gas companies, and then went into government to advise foreign governments on behalf of the U.S. government on energy projects. And then more recently, when I left government, became an academic. And I almost feel like my career sort of describes the arc of the energy industry in the last few years, that I started in oil, and then everything was natural gas for a few years. And the last 10 years has been dominated by renewable energy. And it's worth pointing out that in addition to being a lawyer on every side of these projects, I even spent the last few years advising my parents on the negotiation of 3 leases for solar projects on their family farm. So I feel like I've seen this from all angles, and what I want to share with you today are some of the insights that we've gathered on a very interesting question, and one that was particularly interesting to me, given that background, which is, what are the rules? What are the rules for the development of solar projects? We have an interesting laboratory, almost like a legal laboratory here in Pennsylvania, in that it is, many states claim to have strong traditions of home rule. But I'm gonna claim a little bit of glory here for my colleagues in the Commonwealth, that we have a unique situation whereby there are almost 2,600 different local zoning jurisdictions in the state. In other words, there are nearly 2,600 different sets of rules in just this one state for the development of not only solar projects. You want to build a house, you want to build a warehouse, you want to tear down a barn, whatever it may be. And we set out to answer the question is, well, given this sort of extreme diversity, or at least sort of the options for choices that local officials can make at the local level, what are the actual rules for the development of solar projects? The only way to figure that out was to read all 2,600 different zoning ordinances. So that's exactly what we did. To be fair, my students did a lot of the heavy lifting here. I did not read all 2,600 myself, but we found some really interesting results when we went through and sort of combed through the actual law, the textual analysis, to figure out what the rules are. And we've been sort of updating it over time. Now, let me just point out, I think this has been said by the other speakers, but it's worth emphasizing. There's a reason that it's worth asking, about the rules. There's a reason it's worth talking about ordinances. The first reason, first and foremost, was because our constituents, our local communities, were making requests through the extension program to learn about solar power, about the technical aspects of the projects, the impacts on agricultural lands, and also the regulatory challenges. How do we, as the local zoning board, as the often part-time township officials, get up to speed on how these projects work and how we should regulate them in our backyard? And this conversation about local regulation and sort of the role of local governments and the determination of what goes where, how big, and what the rules are for project development is happening across the country. I like to always cite that second bullet point that you see on the screen here, which is there's a team over at the Columbia University that publishes every few years something called sort of the Database of Opposition to Renewable Energy Facilities. And they found, in the most recent one, this is from May of this year, that there are over 228 different examples of local zoning restrictions that they defined as being restrictive in their language. In other words, it presents the language of the ordinance or the requirements make it more difficult, if not economically impossible, to develop a renewable energy project. Now, this tells you that it's across the country. 35 different states have they found this kind of opposition. I think what's even more interesting is that the last time this report was published was in 2021, and there's only about 100 ordinances at that point. So we've seen a doubling of the number of local zoning ordinances or other forms of regulation that are viewed as restrictive to renewable energy projects in just 2 years. To me, don't just show me the numbers. It's there's a lawyer talking here, but I think a rough analysis would tell you that's a pretty significant increase an indication of a trend line that there is greater and greater focus and greater debate at the local level of how, on paper, to write the rules for what is a massive boom, as we all know, sort of a huge transition in the development of solar power in the US and frankly, around the world. So again, we went and we asked this question in our own state, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and here's what we found. Here's the numbers, pure and simple. Of the thousands of zoning ordinances that we reviewed, we found that roughly 9 out of 10 had no language whatsoever on solar power system. Now, I got to be clear here. This is both for accessory, sort of self-generation, and utility scale. I'll define some of those terms for us later on. But 9 out of 10 jurisdictions said nothing. And what that means effectively is that if you're proposing a solar project in that jurisdiction, you're basically at the whim or the sort of the risk of going through a contentious, board meeting with a zoning board, possibly lawsuits afterwards to fill in the blanks to answer a question that has not been answered, which is what are the rules for building solar? Of the other sort of set, and we've actually revised the numbers recently, it's probably 15% of the ordinances now that actually reference solar, but of that minority subset that actually has language on solar energy systems, half of them, let's say a majority of them, only provide guidance for accessory use, for rooftop systems, for self-generation systems. And so the really shocking number here, and I think the important number, is that really only roughly 1 in 20, 5% of the ordinances that we reviewed have any concrete guidance on the development of utility scale projects. And here we're talking about anything beyond just generating electrons for your own use. And that number hasn't budged very much. And it speaks to one of the challenges here, which is that if we expect solar energy installations to increase, in other words, a larger deployment of solar, because we know the money is going into the industry, we also expect, and there's many studies that have borne this out, that the size of those projects will increase. That we're going to see larger and larger scale projects and larger deployments of those large projects. And so we're concerned somewhat, or there's a gap here in that many of our local jurisdictions are not ready or have not yet put on the books guidance for the most complex and, in the eyes of their constituents, the most impactful type of project, which is that principal use, that utility scale project. And so that sort of, I think, validates the question that we heard before, which is concerns from our local governments that, these things are happening, we don't know how to deal with them. The wisdom isn't there yet. The common practice isn't there yet. We are very much in the very early stage. Again, I'll say the experimental stage of what is the proper way to regulate at the local level, solar energy projects. A few other sort of top level things to note. The reason it matters so much how local zoning is conducted and how we establish sort of best practices or common practices for solar regulation is that, under our tradition of federal democracy and sort of the way that land use works in this country, it is ultimately up to these local governments or whoever the local sort of zoning agency happens to be. In our case, it's hyperlocal, and maybe the county, and maybe the state, and other parts of the country. But they are really the ones who bear the burden of making the final sort of siting decision, the implementation decision. We have at the federal level broad policy sort of pushing industries through tax incentives, broad policy focusing on certain issues, say, for example, environmental protection. We have at the individual level, two parties, the landowner and the potential project developer maybe entering into a contract and they're negotiating their own terms. But what links those two, what allows that contract to turn into a project, is the zoning regulation. And in effect is the translation between a policy saying we should have projects generally and the contract saying we want this specific project. And our local institutions are the ones that have to determine, well, is that particular project compliant with the policy, compliant with our zoning regulation, and therefore this particular project gets to move forward. They are the gatekeeper, effectively, for what we, again, believe are going to be thousands and thousands of solar projects that are going to be developed just in the next few years. Already the flood is there. Already we're hearing from a lot of our local officials, they feel overwhelmed with just the 3 or 4 projects they've seen proposed, let alone the dozens that we'll see in the future. It's worth noting here that, just to point out the numbers for a moment, this is the last time I'll try and talk about numbers. This is not just sort of an abstract question. We know categorically from some decent economic analysis that the level and the sort of clarity of regulation at the local level, at the ordinance level, at the zoning level has a direct impact on project costs. For example, at the residential level, sort of the installation of rooftop systems, there have been studies that have shown that between a jurisdiction that has no rules, where the rules are unclear, and a jurisdiction that has clear rules, where there's been sort of definition in the zoning ordinance of how to develop a project, there's almost a 10% difference in project costs. I mean, a significant margin. If you want to think of it as a risk margin, where you end up paying more because of the absence of guidance, perhaps because of time costs, because you have to wait for a decision. Perhaps, in terms of opposition, it's easier for your neighbor to oppose your project when there's no clear rules on how the project is to be developed. And what's significant is we know that not only do these regulatory decisions have a direct impact on economics, the scale of that impact is increasing. We've seen over time that the actual hardware cost, the cost of the panels and the steel and the inverters and the actual installation cost of solar has gone down significantly, an average of about 18% a year. And as a result, as a matter of sort of proportion, the cost that developers can't control, the cost of financing, the cost of sort of labor, which is outside of their control, and also the cost of permitting and inspection have become a bigger and bigger part of the solar development formula. These days, developers are less concerned with where is the best sun, or even where is the most open land. They can build a solar project just about anywhere, as evidenced by the fact that one of the most popular destinations for solar projects in Pennsylvania is Erie, which happens to be the rainiest part of the state. And they're more concerned with where are the clear jurisdictions. And I would even take the word friendly back and say, we've spoken with developers who've made it very clear, we would rather develop a project in a jurisdiction where the rules are clear and we don't like them, we think that they're a little bit hostile, than in a jurisdiction where we think that the public is supportive, but there are no rules at all. The impact and the risk sort of factor that has been placed on permitting and inspection costs is very real, and has become a significant determination, sort of a determining factor of whether or not a project is going to be successful, economically viable at the end of the day. Now, let me just go forward here to sort of some of the actual language that I want to share with you. We, in our analysis, identified about 24 different sort of key terms, I would say, common terms across the solar ordinances we found that are highly relevant. This is just a sort of a short list of the various issues we focused on, and you see quite a bit of variation. On the one hand, 90% of the ordinances, I would say, share very similar language. They're sort of copy and paste, which is common at the local government level. You look up what your neighbor did, you copy it, but then there's always tweaks. There's always slight changes to the definitions, to the numbers, etc. And so as a result, although there's sort of commonality in a certain amount of terms, key terms that get a lot of public scrutiny, like setback requirements, like glare or sound mitigation, actually have a lot of variation, a lot of sort of inconsistency across this data set. And let me just give you some insight into what examples of what that language can look like. And we'll start at the very beginning, and sometimes I would say the most challenging, which is just defining what is a solar energy project and where does it fall along the scale of, one panel to 1,000, self-generation to utility scale. Here's some examples of language. I'll put these both up on the screen, all three of these, and just give you a moment to catch up. I'm going to drink a cup of coffee, sip my coffee here. So I would call your attention to a few words that really matter. And this is emphasizing how difficult it is to draft these ordinances. Again, we're talking about oftentimes part-time, township supervisors, part-time zoning board, members, part-time even solicitors, the lawyers representing these jurisdictions. And look, for example, we say an accessory solar energy system. This is significant because for the most part, if you fall under the accessory category, you get to develop your project as a matter of right. It really doesn't require a specific authorization from the zoning board. They would only step in if somehow you've gone past what's authorized under this accessory use. Here, an accessory solar energy system consists of, freestanding or roof mounted, that is, here's the key word, intended to primarily reduce on-site consumption of utility power or fuels. That's lawyer speak for you're generating electrons on-site, so you don't have to buy them from off-site, from somebody else. Now contrast that with the third one you see there, a solar energy farm, which they sort of defined as almost like a utility scale project, are systems which exist solely to generate energy for sale back into the energy grid system. rather than being consumed on site. What we found is there's a lot of space between these definitions of accessory to principal, of sort of self-generation to utility scale. I think Tom has described it best in some of our discussions as the light bulb problem, which is if I have a parcel of land and I cover every inch from corner to corner of that land in solar power system, the panels, the inverters and everything, I've now generated energy. So that much we know. Electrons are being produced. But these definitions don't talk about electrons. They talk about the use of those electrons. So if an accessory system is one where I reduce on-site consumption, if I install a single light bulb and I keep that light bulb on and I use just some of my electrons, 0.001% of those electrons to keep on that light bulb, am I all of a sudden an accessory system? Am I now not a utility scale project because I'm using some of that power on site? And by contrast, if I have a school district that has 10 different sites, elementary, middle, high schools and other facilities, and I happen to have an open parcel of land, and I want to develop a solar energy system, a solar, array, and I want to distribute that energy amongst the various buildings to offset my energy costs. Well, if I generate power on one site that is, one parcel of land the school district has, and I then send it off to other sites in the school district, technically, I'm generating energy for use off-site. None of that power is being consumed on site. Now, this is sort of, you can see this as being highly technical, but we've seen this already play out as a significant challenge in the actual operation and the litigation around these projects. So here's an example for you. There's a recent project that came online earlier this year where a dairy facility, a dairy processing facility, built a 1.2 megawatt solar array behind the building. And there was significant sort of debate over, is this an accessory system because they're using some, if not even most, of the energy on site to offset their energy costs? Is it a utility scale system because on the weekends when there's no production at the site, almost 100% of the energy is going off site? Do we have a definition that allows for a blending of the two or finding a middle ground? I've spoken directly with the local officials in this jurisdiction, and they really struggled with coming up with a definition they thought could essentially provide guidance to this project, and again, likely the dozens of projects to follow. Now, in typical lawyer fashion, I don't have an answer to you for this. I don't have a resolution, but I am trying to highlight to you the challenge. Two more quick ones here, because I want to respect that I only have about a few more minutes. Even a relatively benign language. Here's a set of examples we see in many ordinances saying, well, in order to develop a principal project or utility scale project, the lots have to be a certain size. Here, for example, the first one, it says a minimum of 100 acres. And also, we're going to limit the coverage, as we do in many areas of zoning, of how much of a lot you can use for a particular activity, saying that you can only occupy a certain amount of space on any given lot, any given sort of parcel of land. Again, common terminology in zoning, common restrictions that sort of guide the intensity or the density of development. But then we've seen lawsuits. Here's an example of one that's ongoing right now. It was just filed in July. Don't bother reading all the language here, but I'll just tell you the short issue is a township did exactly what we've been suggesting, took the time to put on the books clear guidance on solar energy development. They sort of got ahead of the problem. They're one of that small, subset of jurisdictions that has already acted to try and provide guidance. One of the key aspects of their ordinance says, for example, that any lot is underlined for you at the top there. Any lot used as a solar farm must be at least 50 acres. And that's actually less than the example I just showed you where it said any lot has to be at least, 100 acres. Well, there was an application by a major solar developer, actually one of the largest solar developers in the world. They were rejected on the basis that they didn't meet that and other requirements in the local solar ordinance. And they've now filed suit against the township saying that your interpretation, your sort of application of this ordinance is illegal and capricious. In other words, you're sort of denying the core intent of the law, because the township has insisted that each and every one of the lots used for the project must satisfy these 8 requirements. The developer, of course, is insisting that no, in aggregate, these 12 lots together should be considered the project space, the project lot. And as long as that congregation of lots matches the 8 requirements, we should be issued a development, sort of the permit to proceed. This is significant because we find here on the East Coast, as opposed to the West, where the land holdings are much larger, that most utility scale projects, most projects above, let's say 10 megawatts, often involve more than one parcel of land. Here it's 12 different parcels sort of strung together that we call a leasing pool. We've seen some as high as 18, some as small as 5 or 6 different parcels. And I'll give even a personal example from our own family farm. We've got hundreds of acres, luckily, because the land holdings are a little bit larger out there. But we had to sort of work with a neighbor for one of the solar companies to lease for an easement, just sort of a 2-acre corridor for the passage of lines between 2 different parcels to basically connect 2 different systems under their project design. Well, under the definition you see here, if every lot used as a solar farm has to be at least 50 acres, that small corridor that we use as an easement to connect 2 lots, or any small parcel that's used to sort of piece together the puzzle in a solar project, is incompatible. If that's the clear intent, what could have been done a little bit better in this ordinance is it could have been clear that all lots must comply at the sort of granular level, as opposed to the developer's interpretation that the greater sort of pool of lots has to comply. But this is how difficult this challenge is, and why we're really trying to work towards standard language that is almost bulletproof, because each and every nuance, is it all lots, or is it any lot, is it a group, or is it each lot individually, leads to a lawsuit. And of course, this leads to an expenditure of time and funds and distraction from the work that already is almost overwhelmingly burdening a lot of these local jurisdictions. One more for you here, Tom, and then I'll end on this one. We'll talk about decommissioning. I think there's been a lot of good discussion already. Just to point out that we have a strong tradition of a focus on decommissioning in this state, because we've had a lot of experience with the decommissioning of natural gas facilities and oil facilities. We always like to point out that Pennsylvania had the first oil well, in the world, and we have a long tradition of natural gas and oil development. So we've had to go through this decommissioning question before. But the challenge we found, and let me skip to the next slide here, is that it's a little bit more complex in the case of solar projects in particular, because as opposed to 150 years of experience and understanding of how oil projects work and natural gas projects work, we don't really know what the future of solar looks like. And especially, we don't really know what the end of life of solar looks like. We don't know what those panels are going to be worth. We don't know how complicated the disassembly is going to be. We don't know, and this is important to point out, that there even will be decommissioning. It's actually just as likely in 20 years' time and 25 years' time that they will recommission that site. It's already got the wires, it's already connected to the grid. Why not just upgrade the panels and run for another 25 years? We don't really know what that future looks like. So our tradition of decommissioning being a decision at the time of permitting, the providing of an estimate and a bonding to sort of cover that estimate, we can't have that certainty now. So we had to program into a lot of our ordinances, this is sort of the emerging best practice, the ability to revise decommissioning costs to sort of learn over time. And I've highlighted for you in green there sort of one of the trends, and we've even seen this in some proposed language at the state level, that as opposed to fixing in one point in time a decommissioning cost, there's an expectation, in fact, a requirement that on every 5 years over the life of the project, there will be an update to the decommissioning costs based upon the best available information at the time. And here's where you really avoid paying lawyers for extra work, that there's going to be a use of third parties is one of the emerging trends that we've seen, that re-evaluation, that recalculation of decommissioning shouldn't be a battle every 5 years. There's an agreement ahead of time that sort of market study and that formula calculation will be conducted by a neutral party. And this is, again, an example of why writing an ordinance today is different than even 6 months ago or a year ago, because we're learning these lessons over time. We're sort of learning the fixes to some of the headaches that are coming up. So I would end on the note here that I think that the best sort of guidance and the best insight that we've gained is that it is important to act. It is important that our local jurisdictions get ahead of these issues to put some guidance on the books. But also, we can't lull ourselves into the confidence of thinking you can write it once and forget it. These solar ordinances, this act of regulation is going to have to be an ongoing exercise, updated just like these formulas will be updated in order for it to be effective, because we're working with a fast-moving technology and evolving industry. And unfortunately, our regulations are going to have to be as flexible, as sort of updated on the same pace as well. Thanks, Tom. I have my email address here at the back. Always interested in feedback. And again, knowing that this debate's happening across the country, always eager to hear about examples in other jurisdictions.
Thank you. Thank you to our other two speakers as well. What we're going to do now is we're going to move to questions. Before we do that, I'd like to make a notation that the slides that we're using today will be available. We'll have them up on the website. I'm sure that Garrett is going to put them on the Cornell site, so you'll be able to access them whenever it is that you'd like to circle back with them. I'd like to go to questions, and Mohammed, while you're still there, I'd like to ask you what seems like an obvious question real quickly here. And if you could just respond, because we just have a couple moments left. What do you think is the principal deterrent for municipalities in Pennsylvania, using Pennsylvania's example, with 546 utility scale projects in the queue? What do you think is the deterrent for townships not putting ordinances in place when you're looking at that large wave of potential projects out there coming in their direction? Thoughts?
I'll just say very simply, it's a little bit easier to wait and hope the problem never shows up than it is to get ahead of it, knowing that you're going to have the difficult in meetings, that you're going to have the people screaming at the microphone. And I say this with total respect. These are part-time officials in most cases. They have 100 other things they're worried about. It's a lot to ask for them to turn their attention to this issue. So I think it's a practical decision and perhaps sort of an irrational hope decision on many of their parts. I don't think it's calculated. I don't think there's an intentional ignorance here.
All right, Mohammed, thank you. Sarah, question for you. You mentioned about the tenant payments, I think. I'm not sure quite how you phrased it. It was something along the lines of tenant income. One of the things that we hear quite a bit from, I hear quite a bit from landowners is about ag land rental inflation. I'm assuming that's what you're talking about when you make that comment. And you said you didn't have something in your slide, but you're hearing quite a few comments. Could you share a little bit, maybe along those lines, what you're hearing and any clarity you could provide that way?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is exactly what you're saying. If you still have the same number of farmers in your community, and now you've taken a couple hundred, maybe couple thousand acres out of commission for solar, but you still have that demand, like, where are you going to get more land to farm? And so we know this from years ago in subdivision, when, you know, when we're thinking about subdivision development, that there can be an increase in cash rent rates in the immediate vicinity of that new development, as you know, farmers scramble for new land, and there's just higher demand for the farmland that's around there. This is now on USDA's radar. I actually had a call with them just the other day that they are looking for this, but I haven't seen anything great about that. There was a paper that came out very recently looking at farmland values in the vicinity of solar farms too. And so this is not about the cash rent that you just asked about, Tom, but also, like, what does it do to like, if solar is seen as something that's viable in the area, or ag land is now a hot commodity because it's just not as viable, what does it do to the underlying land price? So that, I'm a non-economist, but these are the things that have been raised when I'm standing in township board meetings. And so those are all active areas for research.
All right, Sarah, thanks. We'll continue to look for more data and more information that way. And I'm sure as you encounter it, that you'll be putting it out there, because again, we keep hearing more and more questions about that, especially at the landowner, from the landowner standpoint, farming landowner standpoint, but others, as you mentioned, when you think about this on a more collective basis. Brady, we had a question for you. It was about row spacing. When you think about your Hay Ready solar, and I would add a little bit more to that, maybe just expand that question a little bit. When you think about row spacing, and you mentioned about autonomous vehicles, I think about self-drive tractors, for instance. It might be able to go in there, maybe smaller, reduced haymaking equipment, smaller round balers, things of that nature that might be able to go in there. And then the last piece that I would add to that, if you kind of think it through in those terms, might be insurance components or resistance from the solar companies seeing equipment like that could damage their panels versus sheep going under them. But now you have equipment going through routinely. Are there concerns? Are they adversarial of that type of situation? Do they require different insurance coverage, et cetera, et cetera? Any thoughts?
That's a good question, and that's something that we haven't specifically talked to our partners with, but something that needs to be thought about. I think we have kind of a running joke amongst our ag group is how long is it going to be before we run into a panel or a ding a panel. And I think that's the beauty of research. That's what we're trying to investigate and take a look. If we don't try it, somebody else will, right? And so as it relates to that, I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. But no, we haven't had those types of conversations as it relates to liability. Some things that we have considered is fixed tilt versus trackers. Could we be doing some of these practices at dusk or early in the morning or middle of the night? A lot of folks out west, when they're making hay, they're doing it in the middle of the night to regulate moisture properties within that product. Could we go every other row and those panels be flipped the opposite direction? So if something did happen, it would hit the back side of the panel, which would have probably a lesser damage than the front side, for example. As it relates to panel spacing, our mock trial that we did, I believe, was 17 foot, which allowed us to get any type of modern day agricultural equipment into those areas. But you're exactly right. As we worked with some of our partners that are in some of those specialized agricultural equipment manufacturers, we are investigating machines that are specifically designed and developed to fit within these utility scale solar sites.
All right, Brady, appreciate the response. I know there's still some additional questions. I could think of a whole lot of questions I'd like to ask you myself. The reality is we have used up the time that we have here. I would invite anybody that participated today to certainly circle back to the last session we're going to do. Bring your questions back. We're going to archive the ones that haven't been answered and some of the others that I'm sure will come up, and we'll make sure that we circle back to them at the again at the last session that we do. I want to mention the next session that we're going to have is going to be on Thursday, October the 12th, same time, noon to 1:15. The focus of that is going to be on solar and agriculture, and we're going to be trying to gain a company's perspective on the challenges and pathways to successful integration of both of them. And we'll have several different solar companies that are going to be a part of that conversation and bringing some different perspectives on the work that they're doing in that regard. So we thank you for joining us today. Please join us again on October the 12th. I want to say one more time, thank you to the speakers today, the panelists today, and certainly the work that you have been doing and continue to do going forward, informing the discussion. You can see we had a great response to our webinar series today, as we have in many in the past. And we welcome you to come back and certainly join us in upcoming sessions we're going to have. So